Jack Becker is a process safety management specialist for Condor Earth. He provides industrial compliance and risk management services to his clients. Mr. Becker is experienced in the development and implementation of California Accidental Release Prevention Program, known as CalARP, Risk Management Plan, RMP, and Process Safety Management, PSM, for a variety of operations. He has conducted many compliance audits, process hazard analysis, and reviews of operating procedures which have provided valuable feedback to improve safety and compliance.
In this session, we're going to cover some operating procedure guidance, review CalARP Program Level 3 operating procedure requirements, and IAR 7 ammonia refrigeration industry standard requirements. So in operating procedure guidance, let's start with the definition of operating procedures. So written step-by-step instructions and associated information such as cautions, notes, warnings, etc., for safely performing a task within operating limits. So that at least gives us a basic definition of what an operating procedure is, and oftentimes these are referred to as standard operating procedures. So goals would be that these are easy to understand, safe, effective, and reliable, and that they meet the regulatory requirements. So there's a difference between a policy and a procedure, and this chart helps explain what those differences are. So policies would be guiding principles intended to influence decisions and actions, while procedures are much more narrow in their application, are prone to change, often stated in detail, and they include the how, when, and who, which describes a process. So this would be a particular way and specific way of doing things. So why are operating procedures important? Well, it's important that the same procedures and methods are used by each operator. They shouldn't be deviating depending on who's performing the operation. We also want those individual operators to consistently execute a particular task as it's intended. And some of these procedures may be critical to prevent or to mitigate a chemical release, and would definitely have some effects or potential effects on employees or the public. So some resources for developing operating procedures: the operating manuals, control narrative, safety data sheets to understand safety and health hazards of the chemicals, piping and instrumentation diagrams for equipment, valve ID numbers, other useful information in the PNIDs that should be referenced or just specifically included in these procedures. Vendor installation, operation, and maintenance manuals are also useful to rely on in developing procedures. And process hazard analysis, these would be things that would show either warning or cautions depending on risk associated with either certain procedures or situations. And if you already have a developed operating procedure, it's a great place to start if you're looking at improving them, either to get up to meeting some of these regulatory requirements or the specific industry standards. Some best practices for developing operating procedures would to be doing this as a team rather than just one individual, and including people on your team from the engineering department, maybe safety, environmental compliance, management, as well as the intended user of these procedures, which would be the operators themselves. Getting their input is probably the most critical because they're the people that are operating these systems every day. Use a template. Some of these have already been developed and can be used for your specific equipment and operation. There are some publicly available by OSHA, and then the previous version of IAR 7 included a template for the procedures as well. Both could be used and retrofitted to meet your current needs. These also help to include quick references to material. So when you're going through the procedures, identifying health hazards or just what the next step is can be better done using a template rather than just starting out with a blank page. Helps guide and give some direction. And then use terminology that's clearly defined or well known. And again, this should mainly be in operator language rather than technical engineering descriptions, because we want it to be clear and effective language. And again, the most critical person for this is going to be the person that's using them, which is going to be the operator. And then an appropriate level of detail should be provided for each step. We don't want to include so much details that these procedures get really long and lengthy and bogged down, but you want an appropriate level that you're providing one action per step. So here's an example of an operating procedure from OSHA. So this is on the Fed OSHA website, still can be used as a reference. It includes the header information to document the revision number and date, and also what this objective and purpose of this procedure is. In this case, it's for a high pressure receiver. And another reference would be from the previous version of IIAR 7 from 2013. It includes a sample SOP for a high stage compressor. These SOP examples have now been moved to one of the other IIAR reference documents. So operating procedures should include step-by-step detail, and this should be one action per step, ideally. And when you're including descriptions in those texts, including valve IDs or equipment IDs are useful as well. So some examples for this would be closed liquid supply isolation valve, HPL 501 and HPL 520. So not only are you describing the valve as the liquid supply isolation valves, but also giving the specific ID numbers that would be on the PNID. And another example, closed dry suction to engine room isolation valves, LPG 521, 524, and 523. So closing multiple valves, the action would be, so closing dry suction to the engine room, and then providing those specific valve ID numbers, which should correspond to valve tags in the field, are helpful when operators are performing the action. So notes, cautions, and warning statements. They're added to provide information to assist the operator in the next step. And next step is underlined here because too often I see these being provided after the step where this information is important. So these are also used to highlight information and importance. And these are typically provided outside of the steps of the procedure. So if we went back to closed liquid supply valve in 501, this would be something that the next step would provide a note or a caution or a warning before proceeding on to the following step. And here's an example of a note. So prior to isolating and pumping out recirculator RPO1, ensure the following equipment has been placed out of service and evacuated. And then those equipment IDs are P2, LP, LTU2. So notes, again, so information to assist the operator in the next step. And these could be for performing that action safely, preparing the user for unexpected, explain the reason for the next step, referencing other materials, helping the user know when the action begins or ends, and then to give other pertinent information regarding the action step. And we want to be cautious of providing too much information in notes. So should be, necessary information for these operators to complete the task. Then with caution statements, these are used to provide the consequences of an incorrect action. And typically these would be adverse consequences to the operation or product quality issues, possible equipment damage or harm to the environment. And when warning statements are used, these are, again, consequences of inaction or incorrect action, but specifically related to injury to personnel or injury or harm to the surrounding community. So moving on now to CalARP Program 3 requirements. The purpose of CalARP is to prevent accidental releases of substances that can cause serious harm to the public and the environment, minimize the damage if those releases do occur, and then to satisfy community right to know laws. And operating procedures fall in this situation where they hit both of these first two bullet points, and following the procedures should help prevent accidental releases. And then if they do occur, then we get into emergency situations or emergency procedures that should minimize damage once that release has happened. So written operating procedures are required under CalARP, and they are intended to provide clear instructions for safely conducting activities, and these should also be consistent with process safety information. For operating phases, there are some specific requirements. I'm not going to read all of them here. These are referenced both in the regulation text as well as in IIAR7. IIAR7 does get to go into a little bit more detail in that they provide mostly all of these operating procedures for each type of equipment that you would find in a closed circuit ammonia refrigeration system. So operating limits and safety and health. These are also requirements that are intended to be in the procedures. Usually these are included before the steps of the procedure to guide the operators to consequences of deviation. Typically, you wouldn't want to reference other documents outside of the procedures when you're listing consequences of deviation, just because you want that information readily available if they need to stop what they're doing and go find another binder of this information. It's not going to be as useful as having it as a reference in the field or when they're being used for training. So steps to correct or avoid deviations also need to be included under the operating limit section. And then for safety and health, these should include hazards, precaution, PPE, and then any of those engineering or administrative controls. So quality control for raw materials and inventory levels should be provided if that's applicable. Any special or unique hazards, and safety systems and their functions. More on operating procedure requirements. So these procedures should be readily accessible to employees who work in or maintain a process. So these can be provided in a couple ways to be readily accessible. These could be a hard copy binder that the operators have access to. It's not restricted. These can also be provided electronically. So if their operating procedures are stored on a network and the operators have access, that's also going to work to provide ready access. The operating procedures should be reviewed as necessary to reflect the current practice and when changes are made to chemicals, technology, or equipment. So anytime there's a change, they need to be reviewed. Typically, these changes would also have updates to the operating procedures as well. And the procedures need to be certified annually that they are current and accurate. I see this being much more useful if you review and certify the procedures individually rather than looking at your 20 or 30 SOPs and on one day adding your certified stamp. And yes, I looked at all of these, they're current and accurate. That level of detail that's in these procedures is hard to capture in just a one-day review. For operating procedures, there are some training requirements. I'm going to touch on these now, but not get too much into training. So these are first for initial training. Operators shall be trained in an overview of the process and in the operating procedures. So these would be procedures that would apply to the operator's duties. The other option for initial training would be to certify in writing that the employee has the required knowledge, skills, and abilities to safely carry out their duties and responsibilities as specified in the procedures. They would have needed to be operating a process before June 21, 1999 for this to apply as a written certification rather than initial training. And there's refresher training. So this should be provided at least every 3 years or when often as necessary. And the key thing in refresher training is it should be that you're assuring that an operator understands and adheres to the current operating procedures. And in the method of testing on training documentation, could be that you use oral verification that they understand. This is probably the least useful in documenting understanding, also that they're adhering to the current procedures. Demonstration and observation are both really good ways at meeting these two elements of assuring understanding, and also they're demonstrating or you're observing them adhering to the procedures. Quizzes or tests also work as well in demonstrating understanding. So now on to IAR 7. This is what the cover looks like on the standard. If you don't have this and you are operating or on the regulatory compliance side for an ammonia refrigeration process, I would strongly suggest that you get this standard. It is really useful in understanding what the specific operating procedures requirements are for the industry. Part 1 is general and includes purpose, scope, definitions, and references. It's not all that useful for me to focus on these now. Move on to part 2, which is about developing and maintaining operating procedures. So some of these requirements will mirror what we've already covered in the CalARP Program Level 3 requirements, like PPE requirements for performing work. Under the safety and health requirements and operating procedures for CalARP, PPE is one of those items that's required. One of the things not specifically called out in CalARP is when the buddy system is to be practiced. And IAR 7 does provide some clarification in the appendix on when this should be practiced, and it's specifically for opening equipment and emergency operations. There might be other systems when you would choose to use the buddy system, and that's perfectly acceptable, but it would be hard to avoid using the buddy system outside of opening equipment or emergency operations. So another item in IAR 7 that's required are references to integrate into the procedures or to just provide them as references. And these would be for lockout, tagout, confined space entry, and opening equipment and piping. So it depends on how your facility would want to handle these, either including them as specific steps or actions in the procedure, or to reference the confined space entry procedures when it's applicable to that operation or action that's being performed. So the version of each procedure shall be documented. This can be done with a revision number and or a revision date. So either one of these are acceptable. And a review of the procedures when changes are made to the ammonia refrigeration system, and update when necessary. So IAR 7 outlines equipment that should be covered in operating procedures, and also includes some system activities. And there are options for either including specific equipment procedures for each of the tasks, or providing these more system-wide holistic procedures. So there are some options with how they are developed. More of this is explained in the appendix than is in the text of the equipment part 3 section. But it does list equipment and phase specific requirements. So for compressors, it goes through which items should be included for initial startup, normal operation, emergency operation, emergency shutdown, and so on. Each of the individual equipment might not need procedures if it's a simple system. The example that's used is skid packages. So typically there would be, one condenser, one compressor, maybe a few vessels, and an evaporator. But these would not be seen as complex refrigeration systems, and their procedures would reflect that as well. So information on the equipment type for operating limits, consequences of deviation, and steps to correct or avoid deviations are included. And most of these are references back to IAR 6 for the normal operation. So in normal operation mode, there's typically just inspect these items. So for compressors, those would generally be all of the daily inspection. tasks for those parameters. And the equipment that is listed is on the screen now. I'm not going to read through all of these, but will highlight that tasks are included in part 3, although it is a separate chapter than most of the other section. Not really a piece of equipment. And some specifics would be for evaporator defrost. This is one that doesn't follow the initial startup, normal operation, or other phases. This would be specific for evaporators that defrost, and that procedures should be provided if manual defrost is initiated by operators. There might be some different procedure for computer-assisted defrost if that's what's used on your system. And it would be more typical to provide a more system-wide defrost procedure for those than this description of what the manual defrost is describing. So oil removal devices, these would include oil pots, and it does go through some of the phases for the equipment for oil pots or oil removal devices. And then safety systems. So these would be including procedures for your ventilation system, emergency shutoff switches, emergency pressure control systems. So for tasks, the 3 tasks that are included are for liquid management. So for charging, transfers within the system. For charging, it would be important to include the quality control items on which type or grade of ammonia is being used in your system. Also, a task is manually purging non-condensables. And then for equipment opening or line breaking procedures. So if that wasn't covered in any of the other temporary operating procedures, it's something that's specifically called out as a task for opening equipment or for opening piping. So in the appendix, this is the informative section, some of which I've touched on here. The first section is on explanatory material, which addresses all of the asterisks marks as you're going through IAR 7. After the section number, there's an asterisk. That would mean that there's some explanatory material in the appendix that might give you some more clarification. The operating procedure documentation section is pretty brief, and then there's some good discussion on system operating procedures, and it gets into some of the simple skid systems versus the complex refrigeration system, and some guidance on where system-wide operating procedures would be more applicable than developing equipment-specific procedures. So there's also the reference and sources of references section in the appendix. So some important takeaways from this presentation: use available resources for the development of your operating procedures. Form a team. It's always better to do these operating procedures and update them as a team rather than just one individual and having somebody else review the work, because these are very specific in the equipment that's being used and references other documentation. It's important that these things line up for the operation of the ammonia system. So use a template. This is something that can be really useful in guiding through the information that's provided, as well as organizing it for quick reference and to know which step is next as you're going through those. Include one action per step, and add in notes, cautions, and warnings where appropriate. So a little bit more in review Refer to IAR 7. The 2019 version is the most up to date as the ammonia refrigeration industry standard. Also refer to IAR 6 2019 for verification of parameters which are within expected operating limits for normal operation.